Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. Let me begin with a simple but powerful question, a question that cuts through the noise. Why is it that every major geopolitical crisis eventually circles back to economics, to wealth, power, and profit, no matter what the headlines claim it is about? This latest development, Donald Trump pushing a bold new peace deal and applying pressure on Ukraine to accept it, is no exception. It is not simply diplomacy, it is not simply strategy, it is, above all, a reflection of the economic pressures shaping the decisions of empires in decline and nations caught in their shadow. So let us take a deeper look, not at the slogans, not at the narratives, but at the material realities underneath. Trump's push for what he calls a bold peace plan has ignited a wave of global debate, not simply because of the proposal itself, but because of what it signals beneath the surface. The moment he publicly urged Ukraine to accept a U.S.-designed agreement, policymakers, analysts, and world leaders immediately recognized that this was more than a diplomatic suggestion. It was a shift in the political temperature of the entire conflict. And here is where the real hook lies. This proposal forces the world to ask whether Washington is now stepping back from its previous posture, or whether it is attempting to reassert control over a conflict that has spiraled beyond its strategic expectations. The phrase bold peace plan is in itself a political tool. It creates the impression of leadership, decisiveness, and innovative thinking, but behind the rhetoric lies a calculated attempt to reshape the narrative. Trump is not merely offering peace, he is reframing the U.S. role in the war. By pressing Ukraine to accept the plan, he positions the United States as the central broker, implying that the conflict's future, its ending, its borders, its negotiation terms still hinges on American authority. This is an attempt to reclaim influence at a moment when global power is visibly dispersing. What makes this development even more compelling is the timing. War fatigue is rising across Europe. U.S. public support for continued military aid is softening, and policymakers are starting to acknowledge the financial and political burden of endless conflict. Trump is capitalizing on this environment. His proposal becomes a dramatic pivot point, a moment designed to grab the spotlight, challenge the existing strategy, and signal a new direction for America's foreign policy identity. This is why the world is paying attention. The plan is not just a diplomatic gesture, but a declaration, one that forces allies, adversaries, and the Ukrainian leadership to confront a changing geopolitical reality, whether they are prepared for it or not. Ukraine now finds itself under growing pressure as the United States quietly recalibrates its strategic priorities, revealing a shift that is far larger than the diplomatic wording suggests. The hook beneath this development is simple but powerful. When Washington begins reassessing the financial and political cost of a conflict, the consequences ripple outward with remarkable speed. What once seemed like unwavering support is now being filtered through a lens of domestic fatigue, budget constraints, and shifting geopolitical interests, leaving Ukraine in a precarious position where every decision carries escalating consequences. For months, policymakers in Washington have faced increasing scrutiny from voters, legislators, and economic analysts, who all point to the same reality: the war has become an expensive and politically sensitive commitment. Billions of dollars have already been spent, military stockpiles are strained, and public appetite for long-term involvement is thinning. This is not simply about cost, it is about priority. As inflation, domestic crises, and election pressures take center stage, Ukraine's war is no longer insulated from American political turbulence, and that turbulence is now being projected onto Kiev. The pressure is intensifying because Washington's calculation is changing. Instead of viewing Ukraine as a long-term strategic project, U.S. leaders are increasingly framing it as an obligation that must be streamlined, constrained, or concluded. This subtle but unmistakable shift means Ukraine is being encouraged, sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully, to consider diplomatic compromises it would not have entertained even a year ago. Every message from U.S. officials, every public statement, every peace proposal is now interpreted by Kiev through the same lens. Is this support strong, or is it weakening? Is aid guaranteed, or is it conditional? What makes this moment gripping is the uncertainty it creates. Ukraine cannot afford to refuse American pressure, but accepting it could mean compromising on sovereignty or territorial integrity. It is a geopolitical crossroads shaped not by battlefield realities, but by political calculations unfolding thousands of miles away, calculations that Ukraine has no power to control, yet cannot afford to ignore. The push for peace coming from Washington carries a deeper and far more strategic implication than most headlines acknowledge, and this is where the real hook lies. It suggests that the United States is approaching the limits of what it can sustain politically, economically, and militarily in this conflict. When a superpower begins shifting from confrontation to negotiation, the world must pay attention, not because of the words spoken, but because of the pressures beneath them. Trump's call for a peace deal is not an isolated political move. It reflects a broader recognition inside Washington that the long-term cost of this proxy war is becoming increasingly difficult to justify. For years, U.S. officials insisted on a strategy of full military support for Ukraine, portraying the conflict as a crucial line of defense for global democracy. But behind those narratives were spiraling expenses, a stretched defense industry, and internal divisions that grew sharper with every passing month. The American public is expressing fatigue, Congress is fractured on aid debates, and U.S. military planners are quietly warning about depleted stockpiles that could hinder readiness in other regions, such as the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. These mounting concerns are forcing Washington to rethink the timeline and trajectory of the war, and that rethinking is now taking the shape of a peace push. This call for negotiation is not driven by optimism. It is driven by necessity. When a nation recognizes that its strategic ambitions exceed its current capacity, it begins to recalibrate, and that is precisely what we are seeing. The appearance of a peace plan allows the U.S. to reposition itself without admitting failure, to shift from a maximalist objective to a more manageable settlement. It signals a transition from an aggressive posture to one of controlled retreat, packaged in the language of diplomacy. What makes this moment especially compelling is the geopolitical message it sends worldwide. Competitors like China and Russia interpret Washington's shift as evidence of overstretch, while allies begin quietly questioning how long U.S. commitments can be relied upon. The peace push, therefore, is not a symbol of strength, it is a sign of strategic restraint emerging from mounting internal limits. Russia views Washington's sudden enthusiasm for a negotiated peace not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a strategic opening, an opportunity to press for advantages that were out of reach earlier in the conflict. And here is the hook that makes this moment especially explosive. Whenever a major power senses that its opponent is hesitating, recalibrating, or showing signs of internal strain, it moves quickly to extract political, territorial, or diplomatic concessions. Moscow understands that the U.S. push for a peace deal is not emerging from a position of strength, but from a recognition of political fatigue, economic pressures, and shifting public opinion inside the United States. To Russia, that signals leverage. This shift has emboldened the Kremlin to harden its negotiation stance. Instead of compromising, Russia is now positioning itself to demand more recognition of its territorial claims, more guarantees against NATO expansion, more influence over Ukraine's future alignment. The timing is critical. With Washington wrestling with divided domestic politics and European allies showing signs of exhaustion, Moscow senses that Western unity is thinner than it was in the early stages of the war. This perception encourages Russia to push for terms that reinforce its long-term strategic objectives, not merely end the conflict. What makes this dynamic even more compelling is the psychological dimension. Russia has long framed its confrontation with the West as a test of endurance who can outlast whom. The moment Washington signals that it is seeking an off-ramp, Moscow interprets it as confirmation that its patience is paying off. This creates a dangerous cycle. As the U.S. becomes more eager for negotiations, Russia becomes less willing to compromise, believing that time is on its side. Russia also recognizes the global implications of an American retreat, however subtle. If the U.S. steps back from its maximalist support for Ukraine, it reinforces Moscow's narrative that the era of unquestioned American dominance is coming to an end. That perception shapes not only Russia's negotiation strategy, but its broader foreign policy posture, encouraging deeper coordination with China, Iran, and other states seeking to reshape the global balance of power. Domestic politics inside the United States now play an increasingly decisive role in shaping the direction of the Ukraine conflict, and this is where the real hook emerges. Foreign policy is no longer being dictated solely by strategic planners. It is being shaped, constrained, and sometimes hijacked by internal political pressures that have little to do with events on the battlefield. Trump's call for Ukraine to accept a U.S. peace plan is not simply an international message. It is a domestic signal aimed at voters, lawmakers, and rivals in Washington who are locked in a heated struggle over the future of American global engagement. Public frustration is rising over the mounting financial burden of endless foreign involvement. Polls show a growing share of Americans across both political parties questioning the billions being sent overseas while domestic issues remain unresolved. This sentiment becomes a powerful political lever, especially in an election cycle where every candidate is searching for a narrative that resonates with economic anxiety at home. Trump's proposal allows him to frame himself as the candidate who can end the war, reduce spending, and refocus national priorities, an appeal that carries real political weight. Inside Congress, the divisions are even sharper. A faction pushing for continued military aid faces increasing resistance from lawmakers who argue that the U.S. cannot sustain unlimited commitments without accountability or clear end goals. These tensions create a legislative bottleneck that directly impacts Ukraine's future support. What once seemed automatic funding, weapons, diplomatic backing now hinges on partisan debates, procedural delays, and shifting alliances on Capitol Hill. Ukraine is watching these developments closely because it understands that every political fight in Washington affects its position on the ground. The dynamic becomes even more intense when framed as a contrast between political identities. Trump's push for a peace plan challenges the current administration's approach, forcing a national conversation about whether continued support represents responsible leadership or outdated foreign policy thinking. In this environment, Ukraine is transformed into a symbol within a larger domestic struggle, a struggle over budgets, global strategy, and the very definition of American power in the 21st century. Ukraine is now caught in one of the most complex geopolitical binders of the modern era, and here is the hook that makes this moment so gripping. The country's fate is no longer shaped solely by its own resilience or military performance, but by the shifting interests, ambitions, and calculations of global power blocs operating far beyond its borders. Every decision made in Washington, every signal from Brussels, Every statement from Moscow carries consequences that Ukraine must absorb without fully controlling the forces behind them. This is the defining tragedy of its position. Its future is being negotiated in rooms where it does not hold equal power. As pressure mounts from the United States to consider a peace framework designed in Washington, Ukraine faces a profound strategic dilemma. On one side stands the necessity of maintaining sovereignty and territorial integrity. On the other stands the reality of dependence on foreign military and financial support. If Ukraine resists U.S. pressure, it risks alienating its most important backer at a time when aid is increasingly contested and politically fragile. But if it accepts a peace plan shaped by external political motives, it may be forced into concessions that redefine its borders, its alliances, and its long-term security posture. This is not simply a policy challenge. It is a historic choice with generational consequences. The situation becomes even more complicated when considering Russia's strategic posture. As Washington signals a shift, Moscow interprets this as a chance to harden its demands, further limiting Ukraine's room to maneuver. The European Union adds another layer of complexity. While Europe remains broadly supportive, internal pressures, economic strain, political fragmentation, public fatigue, are slowly eroding the unified front that once seemed immovable. Ukraine must navigate a landscape where its allies are increasingly divided and its adversaries increasingly confident. This geopolitical tightrope forces Ukrainian leadership into continuous balancing, preserving agency while depending on external support, projecting strength while negotiating from a position of vulnerability. The most compelling part of this dynamic is that Ukraine's struggle is no longer just about territory. It is about retaining control over its national destiny in a world where major powers are recalibrating their interests faster than Ukraine can adapt. As we reflect on these developments, let us resist the temptation to view this as a matter of personalities, Trump versus Biden, Republicans versus Democrats. The deeper forces at work are systemic, not individual. They arise from an economic system struggling with its own contradictions, and they manifest through geopolitical decisions that shape the lives of millions. The real lesson here is this: when capitalism enters crisis, the world becomes more dangerous. Peace becomes a tool of strategy, war becomes a tool of economics, and nations like Ukraine become arenas where these contradictions play out. Our task is to see through the fog, to recognize that true peace requires more than deals, plans, or negotiations. It requires addressing the underlying economic structures that produce conflict in the first place. Thank you for listening. Stay critical, stay informed, and above all, stay aware of the economic forces shaping our world.